Good morning from Washington, D.C. I'm Paul Kincaid, Director of Congressional Outreach for FMC, the Association of Former Members of Congress. I'd like to welcome all of you this afternoon to our fourth session of a special conference on Korea-United States issues sponsored by the Korea Society and Korea Foundation. For those of you who have missed our previous episodes or any of our other programming, I'd invite you to visit our archives at usafmc.org/sounds. There you can check out our other programs and subscribe to our virtual roundtable, which is every Thursday, as a podcast on either Spotify or on Apple. This is an interactive discussion today, so if you have any questions at any time for our panel, simply click the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, fill out your name and your question, and if we choose you, our moderator will call on you to ask your question over audio only to our panel. Again, anytime during the call, just click the Q&A button at the bottom center of your Zoom screen. Today, to lead us in a great discussion about what a new presidential administration could bring with regard to diplomacy between the United States and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, we have an FMC board member who has graciously taken the time to moderate 3 of our conference discussions in the past couple weeks. Peter Roskam, the floor is yours.
Paul, thanks very much. And looking at the panel today, we've got both coasts covered and the Midwest. Congressman Bera is out west in his constituency. I think Dr. Cha is in Washington, D.C., and I'm hovering here in a gray Chicagoland, but we're all together here. And my sense is that there's people together all over the world, because I'm sure that there's some friends in Seoul who are watching us. So first of all, a special thanks, Paul mentioned, but this is only possible through the generosity of the Korea Foundation and the Korea Society, who've made these discussions, this series of 4 conversations with policymakers and experts possible. So a special thank you there. So we've got 2 people who know what they're talking about on U.S.-Korea relationships, and particularly have a view into what might be happening in the future, particularly as it relates to interactions with North Korea. And let me quickly introduce both of our guests who are not new to FMC or these discussions. So yes, there is a doctor in the house, and his name is Ami Bera, and he represents the area just east of Sacramento. So in addition to his healthcare background, he also is strategically placed on the Foreign Affairs Committee, where he chairs the subcommittee on Asia, the Pacific, and Nonproliferation. So he's been very involved, not just making and driving policy, but also as a thought leader on these interactions in particular. And so, Ami, we're grateful for your time today. He's additionally active in the leadership of a group of called the New Democrat Coalition, which if you're looking at House Democratic Caucus politics, is a group that describes itself as committed to pro-growth economics and innovation and fiscally responsive policies. He's joined by Dr. Victor Cha, who is at CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And he's also taken on a leadership role recently at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, where he is the Vice Dean for Faculty and Graduate Affairs. He's an author of many books. His most recent, and what you might find of particular interest, is Alignment Despite Antagonism, the United States, Korea, Japan Security Triangle. I would also commend to you a book that I really enjoyed called The Impossible State, that Victor wrote. And just from a writing style point of view, he writes for a general audience, so you don't necessarily have to be marinating in Korean policy in order to have an understanding and appreciation for his insight. So let's get right to it. Ami, first question is to you. To look at let's take a neutral term as we describe Donald Trump's approach to North Korea, and let's just say it was unprecedented. So I think we can agree on that. In light of that unprecedented nature, some people thought it was a disaster, some people thought it was very clever and innovative, but it was unprecedented. What do you see coming out of that might be positive moving forward? In other words, is there a foundation for anything that you see that can be helpful and as a precedent moving forward? Or was it just from your point of view, a complete disaster? You sense the nuance that I'm looking for here.
I do. And first off, let me thank FMC and the Korea Society for this opportunity and their constant support in bridging the U.S.-Korea relationship. And also, let me just tip my hat to Victor. Having gotten to know Victor over the last 4 or 5 years, and he's been instrumental to my education on the U.S.-Korea relationship, as well as his insights on what's happening in Korea, as well as insights on North Korea. Invaluable to me as a subcommittee chair on the relevant committee. But it's always great to be on a panel with Victor. What I think, I would use the term unpredictable with
Fair
the Trump
enough.
administration, because we forget. It was 3.5 years ago that we were in kind of the fire and fury phase of the approach, and many of us on the Foreign Affairs Committee were cautiously really concerned that we were close to an accidental war or confrontation. And fast forward to 2 years ago, roughly a year and a half ago, where you started to have a conversation laying the groundwork for the first summit, and you started dialogue. And again, many of us on the Foreign Affairs Committee were cautiously supportive of dialogue. We thought that was better than any direct kinetic confrontation, which there would be no good possible outcome, and the tremendous loss of life on the peninsula. And then the last 6 months have been relatively quiet in terms of the Trump administration trying to figure out, would there be a last minute December surprise, last minute December summit. At this juncture, does not appear that we'll see anything in the next 45 days before the Biden-Harris administration gets sworn in. We're still cautious. North Korea has been known at times like this, when there's to do some saber rattling. The message we're sending is, don't do that. That'll just make a kickstart in the Biden administration that much more difficult. But to your initial question, I do think that while the Trump administration approach was unpredictable, I think it does create some opportunities as you go into a Biden administration. I think we have to think about the context of how President-elect Biden historically has approached foreign policy and engagement, much more multilateral than the Trump administration was. So I think you will see an initial attempt to repair a strained trilateral relationship with Japan and Korea. I think you will see much more active engagement to resolve any domestic U.S.-Korea issues, like the burden sharing agreement, the SMA agreement, to get those things off the table. And I would anticipate that that the Biden administration would also create a special envoy to North Korea to really dive in and get a sense of where things are being left off. I think those would be a couple initial first steps. I also think what's changed vis-a-vis the Korean Peninsula and U.S.-Korea, U.S.-North Korea is China is a very different foe, adversary, strategic competitor today than they were 4 years ago. And much of how we think about U.S.-North Korea, U.S.-Korea trilateral relationship, I think will also now get couched in a context of U.S.-China, great power competition, and what that looks like, and how much more complex that is, because all of us said China will have to play a role in how we approach North Korea. So, I'm cautiously optimistic. I think, from a political perspective, foreign policy historically has been relatively nonpartisan. The Foreign Affairs Committee has historically been a very bipartisan committee, where on issues like this, we'd work pretty closely together. And I think that'll happen fairly quickly, that we'll get on the same page, and the same thing in a bicameral way. So I think you'll see policy come together fairly quickly.
Victor, so unmute yourself and then weigh in a little bit. Can you give us a sense of sort of foundational things? Pick up. What do you think of Ami's observation that there could be some opportunistic thresholds that present themselves. Do you think that that's true? That Donald Trump basically flipping the political game board in this in North Asia had that impact or not? What's your sense of it coming in? And then we'll unpack a little bit further into the discussion the prospects of how the president-elect approaches things. But what's the playing field like right now, end of 2020?
Well, thanks for the question, Congressman Roskam. Thank you for chairing today's session. And it's always good to be on with Congressman Bera, who's been a real leader on the Hill when it comes to policy towards Asia. I hear that constantly when I talk to friends in the region as well. So thank you so much for your leadership, and thanks to FMC and for the Korea Society Korea Foundation for putting on these series of events, which I think are very informative and very helpful. On where we are at the end of 2020, so I think starting with the whole question of alliances and partnerships in Asia, I think that the Trump administration came in and had a very different view of alliances and partnerships. And I'm not going to say it's right or wrong, because there isn't an absolute right or wrong, but it was a very different view. And it was a view that really focused on trying to get as much out of the allies as possible and assessing each of these alliances on a balance sheet in terms of what were the assets and what were the liabilities. But I think one of the issues there was discounting on the asset side how important these alliances were for aggregating U.S. power. I think for the most part they were seen as detracting from U.S. power, and therefore it was all about payback, like whether it was a $4 billion SMA agreement or whatever it might be, tariffs with regard to trade, that these sorts of things were all reflected a view that these alliances were extremely expensive and that they didn't accomplish what the United States wanted, and therefore we need to look at them completely differently. And so for that reason, I think a lot of our allies were a little bit rattled, not really clear about the future of the US presence in Asia, and really looking for leadership and direction from the next administration. On North Korea, I think there was as Ami said, it was a very unpredictable 4 years. We went from the brink of war to love letters, right? And then to kind of, nothing going on, right? In terms of the diplomacy, which is, taking us sort of in all sorts of different directions. During this period, whether we're talking about potential for war or love letters and things of that nature, one thing stayed clear and constant, and that was the continued growth of the North Korean weapons program. They have done 30 ballistic missile tests since the last summit meeting in Hanoi, Vietnam. And as we all remember well, in 2017, they started out by doing 20 ballistic missile tests. And last October, they displayed in their parade for the first time what looked like a 4th generation sea-launched ballistic missile, and then a massive ICBM missile that many people believe may be capable of carrying multiple nuclear warheads, not just one. This is a vast growth in their capabilities, and they're flaunting it. So that has not changed. On the diplomacy side, I would say the one thing that we did learn from the summit diplomacy that Trump did was that it really tested the hypothesis and the criticism that the past 2 agreements that had been reached under Clinton and Bush, the 1994 agreed framework and the 6-party talks, were always criticized as being faulted for not finishing the deal at the top, right? A meeting between the leaders. Clinton almost did one. President Bush never had planned on doing one. And that if we just met at the leader level, we could solve all these problems. Well, we clearly met at the leader level 3 times, and who knows how many letters have been sent back and forth, and it has not achieved that. So we did learn something from the Trump summit diplomacy, which is that these leader meetings on their own are not going to do it, which was the untested hypothesis in the last one. And then more broadly, again, going back to something that Congressman Bera said, so the big question going forward is there's the North Korea problem, but then there's also China, right? And the U.S.-China relationship is in a very different place than it was 5 years ago. When the two giants in the region tussle, right, it has ripple effects for everybody else in the region. So every other country in the region is adjusting to this. Some of them are feeling real pain, like Australia, like South Korea did in 2017 over THAAD. And so what direction the U.S.-China relationship goes will have a very important bearing on the North Korea problem, but more broadly, all of our allies in the region. So that's kind of where I see us sitting at the end of 2020. A lot of flux and clearly a yearning for more direction and more stability from the United States going forward.
Victor, let me press in on the point that both you and Ami made, and that is this changing relationship that the U.S. has with China. And you know, to go back, just one observation and then a question. One observation is there's this really growing bipartisan consensus in the United States that the relationship needs to change with China. And I go back to 2016 and you look at the debate between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, where they both asserted that they wanted to get out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now that's not a Chinese issue per se, but it's sort of perceived as China, a China issue. And I think it was a foreshadowing of what's to come. And, you know, just this week, the House passed overwhelmingly the Holding Foreign Corporations Accountable Act, which limits Chinese companies' access to American exchanges and capital markets. Very, very significant. Okay, so with that as a prelude, here's my question. I always imagined this imaginary conversation between an American president and President Xi, and it goes basically something like this around North Korea. But the American president would say to the Chinese president, we don't have a problem with what North Korea is doing, you know, saber rattling and so forth. You have a problem with what they're doing because either you fix this or we're going to fix it. If we, the United States, fix this, you're going to have a disaster on the peninsula, and then just lay out the catastrophic impact from a refugee point of view, military interaction, the economics of it all. You, China, have the capacity to really influence this. So get on it. Either you fix it or we're going to fix it. Now, that presumes this close client-state relationship between China and North Korea. Is that valid or is that overstated? And is it? Can you give us a sense of the relationship right now between North Korea and China on that basis, Victor?
Yeah, I'm sure. Thanks for both the observation and the question. I think on the question, so of course China is critical to North Korea's survival as a nation state today. 95% of North Korea's external trade is with one country in the world, and that's China. And so they need China desperately. At the same time, they also know that if they collapse, that would be China's strategic nightmare. And so I think they're also willing to leverage that. You know, they're willing to leverage the fact that if they collapse and this concern about refugees and all these other sorts of things, that they will that is a source of power for them. And you know, the North Koreans don't have much, so they know how to negotiate with what little they have. So I think it's certainly a close relationship that goes back for decades. The relationship between Kim Il Sung and Mao. Mao's son died in the Korean War, so it's been a very close relationship. But lately, I would say there's quite a bit of tension in the relationship too. China exploits the northern part of the Korean peninsula for mineral resources and treats North Korea very poorly. The North Koreans don't like that, but that's their only source of hard currency. Right now, the really big problem in terms of the North Korea-China relationship is that the border is closed. The border is effectively closed. All the sanctioning we've been wanting China to do on North Korea is now effectively being done by the North Koreans themselves, basically as a preventative measure with regard to COVID. They have shut the border down, and they've effectively shut down all trade between China and North Korea. And this is absolutely killing the North Korean economy right now. They are in very, very bad shape. So Yes, I can imagine presidents having that conversation with China, and the Chinese president not necessarily disagreeing, but then walking away from that table and just doing the same thing all over again, which is to kind of muddle through. And then anytime it goes to crisis, either using incentives or stakes to bring North Korea back to the negotiating table with the US. And then once they're back at the table with the US, then handing everything off to the United States and saying, now you go have a 6-month, 8-month, 1-year-long negotiation with them and achieve a freeze, right? And so, that is not optimal for the United States. It's clearly not optimal for the United States, but China's willing to accept that, right? They're willing to accept that because they are not as concerned about the nuclear threat as the United States.
Ami, what's your sense moving forward? Do you think that there will be joint military exercises with South Korea, U.S., South Korea, joint military exercises moving forward under a Biden administration, those that were frozen over the past few years?
I certainly think most members of Congress would be supportive of a resumption of the joint training. It's been a while, and you can only do so much with computer simulations. For troop preparedness and readiness, you really do have to do those joint exercises. That obviously will be seen as a provocative move by the North. So, again, my sense it would be that the Biden administration would try to resolve some of the issues between the U.S. and South Korea prior to resumption of that. And that also opens up the Biden administration is going to look at North Korea potentially a little bit more differently than President Moon's administration, which I think really does want to fast track peace first. And, I think the Biden administration will want to see the North Koreans make some real tangible steps towards denuclearization. And so you've got to resolve those issues as well to make sure everyone's on the same page and we're speaking with one voice. And I think that'll take a little bit of time. But yeah, I think you would have congressional support for, resumption of the joint training. And I think, most of us thought President Trump gave that away too easily. And we really did not get anything tangible in return.
Can you press in a little bit further? That's an interesting observation that you made about sort of the different underlying motivations between the Moon administration and the Biden administration. Maybe not completely different motivations, and that's not quite as articulate as it should be, but the point that you made that they could be on different timelines or sequencing different things. Could you just give a little bit more color to what you think the two, and compare and contrast the two?
Certainly, and I'll also defer to Victor because he may have greater insight on how the Moon administration is thinking about this. But I do sense that there's a greater desire to, lift sanctions, resume economic activities, move towards peace, officially end the Korean War. I think those are things that the Moon administration would really like us to like to see as initial gambits. And I just think the history of North Korea is if you give them something, you may not get anything in return. They may make some promises. And I think we lose our leverage if we move too quickly in that direction. And, I think that's something that'll have to get resolved between the Biden administration and the Moon administration. And, as we start to think about what those next steps are. Victor, maybe you can give some insight into how both the Moon administration, but also the Korean populace is thinking about, this as well.
Yeah.
Great question.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think they are on different timelines. The Moon administration has, just a little less than 2 years left. If you consider a little less than 2 years left in a single 5-year term presidency, right? And so, and if you think about when the speculation starts, it starts a year out. So they have less than a year left. And so, I think they are very strongly focused on trying to achieve some sort of peace declaration, end of war declaration, on the peninsula, and restarting inter-Korean economic engagement, family reunions, all those sorts of things. And I think frankly, I don't think it's politically motivated. I think it's just something that this group ideologically believes in. I think they ideologically believe in inter-Korean reconciliation as being paramount, right? And it's like Americans believe in democracy, right? This particular group of people in power really believe in inter-Korean reconciliation as being paramount. And so they don't want to see the momentum, in their minds, the momentum lost, although I don't know if there was a lot of momentum at the end. Momentum lost, and what they really don't want to see is for it to start off badly with a North Korean provocation, as they have done to the last two presidents, President Trump and President Obama. And so I think they are, they're ready to move full speed ahead. I think they really want to do that. And of course, you have a new administration, a Biden administration, that's just at the very beginning of this. And I think most importantly, and the thing that's underappreciated by Koreans when they think about this, is they have to understand, for the Biden administration, this is one of many, many issues that they have to deal with. And it's certainly not the most severe issue they have to deal with. There are many others, as we all know well. Whereas when Trump came in, this was the issue. North Korea made themselves the center of attention, and President Obama told him that this thing was going to blow up pretty soon. And so I think that, there is kind of that mismatch. We've had it before, right? When Kim Dae-jung was the president of Korea and George Bush became president, we were in a similar situation where South Koreans had just held their first ever inter-Korean summit, between Kim Dae-jung and Kim Jong-il, and new president was coming in, and the South Korean administration came very strong, very hard at the new president, saying, this is the way you have to do it, you must do it, this sort of thing. And it put the US and South Korea, at a bit of odds. And so, so I think we certainly don't want that to happen. But yeah, there is a little bit, as your question suggests, Peter, there is a little bit of mismatch in terms of timing. And the only way to resolve that is to have really sort of deep and extensive consultations between the two sides before saying anything publicly, right? Not try to box the other side in, right? Just have really quiet consultations about how to coordinate next steps.
And do you get the sense, so can you both made this observation about, you discussed multilateralism as a new priority or a new tool. Victor, you made the observation of the value add or the magnification of American power through alliances, to sort of restate it. So set aside Japan for a second, because we'll come to that. But can you unpack who else is going to play a key role here from an alliance point of view? We know. Well, let me just ask it like that. What's your sense? Who is going to be coming in to see you when their ambassadors are making the rounds and their delegations are making the rounds? All kinds of world leaders and legislators are coming into your office. Who are friends who are going to be talking to you about North Korea, do you think?
Victor alluded to it. There's so many other things that are going on at this juncture, and it is different than 4 years ago. That a lot of it's going to be couched in the U.S.-China conversation. And we've had these ongoing conversations throughout the last 4 years with Australians, with Japan, with India, thinking in the context of maritime security, but also vis-a-vis China. And I may answer the question a little bit differently in terms of the role that South Korea can play in the immediate term in the next 6 months, because everything also is going to be couched in the COVID-19 response. And you are seeing the South Koreans take a leadership role with the ASEAN nations, and putting partnerships together in the region to talk about vaccine distribution, and getting through this next phase. And that may take the forefront as opposed to a resumption of Korea Peninsula talks between South Korea and North Korea. But I think that also gives us an opportunity as we work with the Koreans and work with the countries in the region, the ASEAN nations and others to address the COVID-19 response. Hopefully we can also create these alliances and partnerships and relationships, resume the era of diplomacy, to then allow us to also say, okay, how do we address the nuclear threats on the Korean Peninsula, but also in the region, because the entire region obviously would be affected. And I think that creates an opportunity for us diplomatically, but also for the Koreans as they take on a bigger leadership role vis-a-vis COVID-19.
Victor, what do you think? Allies in the region, who's going to be playing a key role, and set aside Japan, because we want to talk about that separately.
So I think it's, so I, like Congressman said, this is not just a Korean Peninsula problem. I mean, North Korea is a horizontal proliferation risk to the world, especially given the growing size of the program. We're talking about now, 20 to 30 weapons, fissile material for maybe 80 more weapons, and then, this long-range technology. So, there are proliferation risk for a lot of countries, whether it's in the Middle East or whether it's in Europe. And so I think, I would hope that one of the things that the administration does in this respect, as Ami said, in its focus on multilateralism, is to really bring all the others into the conversation, whether it's with regard to UN action, or whether it's security assurances, on the positive incentive side, to bring them all in. Because I think increasingly all the other countries, not just in Asia, but US partners in Europe and others, are understanding the gravity of the North Korean nuclear weapons program, ballistic missile, the growth of the program. I mean, I think they understand the gravity. This is an unprecedented case of proliferation outside the NPT regime. And so it's going to become more in everybody's interest to see this, at least to see this capped. I mean, at least to cap this program and stop it from growing anymore. And so in that regards, the P5 countries, like the British will be important, the French will be important. If there are movements towards things like sanctions and embargoing, or going back to things like the Proliferation Security Initiative, then countries that are involved in freedom of navigation, like Australia and others, will play a role. And then on the sanctions side, all these UN member states are subject to the multiple Security Council resolutions against North Korea, and it's their responsibility as UN member states to comply with those sanctions if there is illegal North Korean behavior taking place, or activities taking place inside their countries. So this, you have to give the Trump administration credit for this. This is something that they did very aggressively, where they went around to UN member states and, provided specific information saying, this is what the North Koreans are doing in your country and you have to stop it. And so that's a very important part of the sanctions package that will require lots of friends and partners to be playing a role.
Peter, if I could just add on to
Victor, let me follow up, please.
I was just going to say,
Tommy.
If I think about my other hat on the subcommittee, nonproliferation, and a lot of the treaties and that were in place at the start of the Trump administration have eroded a bit or expired. And President-elect Biden has a history of really leaning into nonproliferation, so it'll be very interesting within that context as we either revive some of the prior treaties or refresh them to be much broader, how we do that vis-a-vis North Korea, and as Victor pointed out, a broader multilateral alliance, and and also thinking about China in the context which the Trump administration was trying to bring China into some of these treaties. That's not going to be easy, but how the Biden administration approaches that. And then just the last thing that I know on the subcommittee we're spending a lot of time thinking about is the bad actors in the world that want to wreak havoc, that want to create disruption, have just seen a virus do something that a nuclear warhead couldn't do. Just bring the entire world to its knees. And unfortunately, the technology to do genetic editing, manipulation, that's helping us build these vaccines really quickly. Also, it's the same technology that can can create that next virus and that pandemic. And that's something that we have to take very seriously as a global community, and the bioterror threat and how we do this biosurveillance, really beefing that up at an international level. And that's something, I wouldn't put it past North Korea to be thinking about some of those tools, which are much harder to detect.
So let's pick up on that a little bit. Victor, do your best to take us behind the curtain into North Korea. And I know that this is, it's a parlor game in some ways, but so during the Trump presentation to Kim Jong-un, it just struck me as okay, the idea that Kim Jong-un can be welcomed into the community of nations, into the fellowship of nations, it just seems like is never going to happen based on past conduct and Stalinistic repression within his own country. The notion that he's going to be reconciled to the nations is a little bit overselling. Give us an insight as to what do you think the North Korean leadership is looking for right now? And is it a monolith? Is it a fragmented group at this point? Are there fissures within the family, so to speak? Can you just give us some color on where you think the current thinking is and where the power sources are?
So like you said, there's a lot of guesswork involved here because we don't have a lot of good information about what goes on inside the most opaque regime in the world. But I think that, in the time that Kim Jong-un has been running the country now, what is it now, 8 years or more, there was initially some speculation about whether he'd be able to hold on to power, but it looks like he has successfully held on to power, consolidated it, gotten rid of a lot of people along the way, but he pretty much seems to be in power. He's been giving delegating more responsibility to his younger sister, which has been the topic of a great deal of speculation over the summer. And so I think they're kind of a tag team, the two of them. But without any evidence to the contrary, we would be wrong not to assume that he is in control. And I think that's the case. Now, what does he want? Very clearly, based on sort of recent pronouncements and the announcement of this Workers' Party meeting in January, he's very unhappy with the economic situation in North Korea. Part of this was a result of the major flooding they had over the summer, which has really killed their crops. It's also because of COVID, like I said, their growth, the economy is going to contract by like 8% this year, according to some estimates, which is as bad as it was during the famine. So it's clear that he wants to improve the economy, and maybe that's what Trump was holding on to, right? That somehow he could offer him things to improve the economy. But I think that the real problem is, what is he willing to give up? This is Kim. What is he willing to give up in return for an improvement of the economy? And is he willing to give up a little bit of control and allow foreign investment in the country? Possibly, right? Is he willing to give up all of his nuclear weapons, which is what the basic quid pro quo that the world wants from North Korea? That is not at all clear. And if anything, and if I were the North Korean leader, I would want both. I would want to keep my nuclear weapons and have economic interaction with the rest of the world and have, as President Trump said, beach condos at Wonsan and casinos and all this stuff. I'm sure he would want those things, but he would want both. And that's, that is the most difficult part, because when it comes down to the diplomacy, it's how do you convince the North Korean leader that he cannot have both, and that he can only have one. In terms of the notion of the rest of